Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode, we're going to refine our color palette for both the light and dark themes of our UI, as well as take stock of the design and code components we'll need to build. So what I've done is created a couple reference lists, or a little bit of an inventory of the things we'll need to build out the completed UI design. So here on the left, we have a component inventory. This is basically taking a look at the design and breaking things down into larger component chunks, and also thinking about what individual elements create those components, as well as any unique states that the component or its elements might take on. So for example, in the sidebar, if we pan over here, we have the logo, we have the links, and the links can also take on an active state. Now keep in mind that these states that we note in our component inventory aren't necessarily native states like hover, focus, visited, active. Instead, we're making note of states that are specific to the visual communication of the UI. So here with the links, this active state doesn't mean when the link is actively pressed. Instead, it's communicating which view we're currently looking at within this app. So looking at this component inventory, we have the sidebar, the header, inbox, the detail pane, and our reply pop-out. And that matches the overall layers that we grouped when we started recreating this design. On top of that, we also anticipated a couple shared components that basically are reused throughout the UI. So our avatar components, you can see we have a default and small variation that are used throughout. And we also have tooltips that can appear in multiple spots as well. So in addition to our component inventory, it's now a good time to start thinking through the final color palette that we need, not just for the dark variation of our theme, but the light variation as well. And so here on our styles groups on the right, you can see that we color sampled quite a huge number of colors from the original designs. And what we're going to do is basically get rid of all of these source sampled colors and start finalizing our palettes for both themes. So with this inventory, I've thought through what are kind of the component colors that we might need. Typically, I might go through and name colors based on their look and feel. Like here on the right, we originally named the grays gunmetal versus cool gray or electric. But because we are anticipating a dynamic theming, we're going to have to frame our colors around their component use. So our main background has a dark and light variation. There's also a high and medium contrast within the UI. If we look at the typography and kind of that hierarchy that we're seeing here. And we also have to think through the different elevations that we have. So with our actively selected message, that's at kind of a first elevation, and then our reply box sits on top of that. So that's kind of at the highest elevation within the UI. So by giving colors in our palette these functional names, we'll be able to swap out the actual color values dynamically when it comes time to code this UI. And I think the naming being consistent based on function will be less confusing when we start trading things in and out as users toggle between the light and dark themes. Lastly, similar to color, you'll see that we had quite a few specific typography styles or specs that we pulled out of the original design. So besides these three documentation text styles, we have probably a dozen or so of these specific and unique variations of typography. And after kind of considering things, I think we only need really about 5 for the UI and 1 for the logo type as well. We might refine this a little bit, but basically it looked like we also have a reference design off to the right here. It looked like we have this highest level title for the subject line as well as the inbox label. We had this kind of secondary tier label for the sender in the current message, as well as the subject line in our message list. And then from there, we basically just had some body copy variations and a slightly smaller body copy that's used for some of these tinier details, like the attachments, or maybe even the sender in the message list. So I think overall, we might be able to get away with just a few type specs once we get down to more of a design system approach with everything. Last part of our inventory real quick is I like to take stock of the different box shadows that we'll have to specify. So typically I like to think of this in terms of elevation. How far visually does this component have to sit on top of the main background? So looking at our design here on the right, it seems like the tooltips are probably at this first elevation. The active message kind of sits above that visually. And then the reply pane is the closest to the user in terms of its visual presentation. In addition to that, we also have these blue box shadows with our accent buttons. So you can see that this one is maybe sitting a little bit higher up. And I wasn't sure, but I kind of anticipated this PDF attachment with the box shadow as another variation of that accent elevation. So with all that in mind, let's start by first off just removing these color styles from our file just to get things cleaned up. So I'm going to take care of that real quick. All right, so with those color styles cleared out, let's begin working through our color inventory list. And what I'm going to do is just copy this over to the right, so that way we can keep it in frame as we start going through and refining this palette. So first up on our list is the top of the logo. So let's temporarily create a rectangle so we can color sample the colors that we have in our UI here. So with that, we can quickly make a new color style. And let's just call this the logo top. And we'll get the others added quickly here. So we have the middle of the logo. And add that as a color style. And lastly, let's grab the bottom of the logo, which I believe will match our primary accent color, but we might want to tweak this as we go. Okay, cool. So we have our logo colors sampled now. I think what we want to do from here is probably tackle, in terms of the UI, the most difficult contrast requirement first. So with UI elements and color contrast, we need to have a 4.5:1 color contrast ratio in order for our UI to be considered fairly accessible or to meet certain accessibility standards. And looking at our UI, it seems like we have the most challenge in terms of typography contrast inside of this reply pane. So zooming in here, you can see we have this kind of subdued gray on top of this fairly light gray background. And I know for a fact that this is not going to pass color contrast requirements. But what we can do is think through, how light does this secondary gray have to be, or what value this reply background should be in order for there to be enough contrast. So I like to start off my palettes by thinking through what is the most difficult thing to achieve good contrast with, and everything else surrounding that. If things are on the more extreme end of light and dark values, then you're guaranteed to be within contrast needs. So I'm going to click into here and let's grab this kind of secondary gray. I believe in our color inventory, we refer to this as the medium contrast. And I've switched over to my browser here with a web app called Colorable, which I'll link in the description below. And this is something I really like to use for checking color contrast, but it also has HSL values, which you can quickly tweak to get the contrast you're looking for. So I'm going to paste in that kind of medium contrast gray that we have. Let's go back and grab the background of that reply pane. So with our reply layer, let's go to the plate and open up this gradient and find out what the first color on this gradient is. So it looks like 234, 11, and 36. So we can dial that in using the hue, saturation, and lightness. So we had 234, 11, so this would be 0.11, and 36 on the whiteness. Okay, so you can see that we are failing to meet color contrast ratios pretty strongly here. So what we'll want to do is we can darken the background and also lighten this medium gray. And what we'll do is make sure that there are still opportunities for further differentiation along that scale. So we can still go darker in the UI, we can still go lighter with our typography, and still have some visual hierarchy while making sure that everything across the app, all combinations of background and foreground, will be accessible. So first thing I'm going to do is probably brighten up the typography text a little bit. And our app's UI theme is always based around this hue of 234. So I'm actually going to tweak this hue to match as we adjust either the saturation or the lightness here. First, I'm just going to grab the lightness and pull it up a bit until we're roughly passing. Okay, and after playing around with the saturation and lightness a little bit, I think I like this slightly more saturated gray that has a 4.64 contrast with the background. Now with this background, I still might tweak it a little bit for a little bit better contrast. So let's play around with the lightness a little bit and see if we can find something we like. All right, so I think I'm happy with this combo. We have above a 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio. So now let's grab these and finalize some of the values in our UI. So we can grab our temporary swatch here and let's paste in that hex value. Double checking our hue is at 234. It looks correct. Now let's add this as our medium contrast, and this will be the dark variation. Next up, grabbing our background. This will actually be our highest elevation background, and it's the start of that linear gradient. So we can get this added by pasting it in. Everything's looking good with the HSL values. So we'll have elevation 2. This is the background and the start point. And while we're at it, let's figure out what the stop point for that gradient should be. So our reply plate, let's go into our linear gradient and grab that value quickly. We have 234, 13, and 29. So this is roughly what the end of that gradient will look like. And as you can see, it's just getting better and better in terms of contrast, but we still have room to go up in terms of the lightness for our typography. So we can definitely have a higher contrast version and that secondary hierarchy. We can still go a fair bit darker with the background to give it that differentiation in terms of the elevation that we're looking for. So again, I'm going to tweak this just slightly till I find something that looks good to my eye. Cool, and I think I like things here. So let's grab this hex value. And we can apply it to our swatch. Double check our hue is set correctly to 234. And this will be our elevation 2. Background end. Looking good. While we're at it, let's tackle the first elevation that we see with our active message. So we should have already addressed the most difficult contrast requirement. Things should be much easier from here. And after tackling this gradient, we can quickly get in the component backgrounds, the highest contrast typography, and the main background of the app fairly easily. So let's go into our inbox here. Collapse down some of these layers just to clean things up. We'll go into our inbox layer, the plate for that, actually the message active, and that plate. Let's grab the first stop of our gradient. It's at 11 saturation and 36 lightness. So just slightly different from the reply pane that we saw. Make sure our hue is looking good. And tweak this just a little bit to our liking. We'll copy this over. This will be our elevation 1, background start. And do the same for the end stop of that gradient. So we're going to go with 11 and 25. I want to keep that hue the same throughout our color scale. So 11, and we'll bring the lightness down quite a bit to 25 or so. As you can see, we're keeping our medium contrast typography. This is kind of the worst case for type contrast that we have to check against. And as we're going through the more extreme values of our UI, the contrast is just getting stronger and stronger. There's still plenty of room to spare in terms of bumping up the lightness or lowering it for the background. All right, so we have our gradients taken care of overall. I'm going to get this inventory updated real quick here. All right, so making our way through this list. Now let's start working on some of the easier stuff to tackle. So we have our main background, which I think we can just sample pretty much directly. Going to our sidebar for this. Let's open this up and check our hue saturation. I want to keep that at 234. So it's like we'll tweak this to be 333441. Let's add this as main background. And this will be the dark variant. And I just realized something real quick here is we need to name our elevation colors for the dark theme, since we still have to anticipate the light theme as well. So let's get that adjusted here real quick. And I might actually make sure the theme variation is always at the end of the name, just to keep things organized. And let's quickly rearrange these just to make a little bit more sense here. All right, that's looking better. Next up, let's grab this main background for all of our components. So I'm going to grab the header plate and pop this open to look at the HSL values. All right, so we can get this added as component background dark. And the reason why I'm not going back to Colorable for each of these colors is we already know our contrast ratio is looking good. So we're just going off our eyes to make sure we like the current saturation that we're seeing, and also that everything sticks to that same 234 on the hue, just to keep things feeling harmonious throughout the design. All right, so we got our main and component backgrounds. Let's now take care of the high contrast typography. I think this is just pure white in our design, but let's double check. We can go into our message detail pane and find the sender name as an example. Looks like we're using pure white. Just to demonstrate, if we put in our higher contrast typography, we're going to have more than enough contrast ratio, even meeting AAA standards, which is great. So I think we're going to keep that white as the color that we want for high contrast text with our dark theme. And make sure everything is arranged accordingly. All right, next up we have a couple border elements which don't need specific contrast, but need to be set off a little bit from the component background. So typically I would refer to this kind of border as a component guide of sorts. And we can use that throughout our design here. So I think I'm actually just going to set it to be equal to the main background color. So we can just create that temporary swatch. Let's sample our main background color. Actually, let's make sure that it has the exact same hex value. So we'll copy that over. And I'm going to create a separate color swatch just because we are naming things functionally. So let's call this the component guide. This will be the dark variation. We might tweak this further once we get the borders and the rest of the final color palette in place. All right, so next up we just have this accent blue to settle on, and then the couple colors we use for highlight text. And I think that should take care of all of the dark theme palette. So this PDF attachment preview is probably the most saturated version we have of the accent color. We'll want to verify that it matches the same hue that we see in the send button and other prominent UI buttons throughout our design. So let's just sample these real quick and see where we're at. So grabbing this super saturated blue, it looks like this is extremely close to the bottom portion of our logo, which we'll probably treat as the primary brand accent. So we'll match that exactly. Let's just verify that these UI buttons roughly stay within that same hue. Seems like they're at 234. Yep, that stays consistent throughout. And looking back at our inventory, we have this super saturated accent, and then we have the medium and light versions for these gradient stops that we need for the buttons. So that accent color, I'm going to set to be equal to our bottom portion of our logo. And let's detach this color style so we can create a dedicated one for accent. Now note that this won't change based on the theme since the accent colors remain the same throughout. What we will want to ensure though is that any white icon or text on top of it has enough contrast ratio with the light variation of our accent. So let's start figuring out what we want for the gradients that we apply to these buttons. So I'm going to color sample this lightest stop since that'll be the most challenging to achieve good contrast with. Looks like we have 234, 93 on the saturation, and 68 on our lightness. So we'll be using white icons on this, but we want to make sure that we can get enough contrast even with this lighter variation of the accent. So we'll bump up the lightness to 68, and you can see that we're not quite making it for our AA standard. So we just need to bring the lightness down here a bit. All right, so after tweaking that a bit, I think we can desaturate that slightly and bring the lightness down to get enough contrast. So I'm going to copy this over, and this will become our accent light. Let's go ahead and rename that first swatch to just be accent. Let's say it's the default. Next up, let's get the end stop of that gradient sampled. It's looking pretty saturated here, but let's just verify that using Colorable. All right, so pasting this in, we definitely don't have any contrast concerns here. Let's maybe adjust the saturation and lightness though, just to make sure that we like the actual color objectively. All right, so I tweaked this a little bit just to get it looking as I like it. And let's get this pulled over to be the medium variation of our accent. So accent medium. Make sure our layers are sorted neatly here. Last up for this dark theme is the highlight background. Actually, I think they'll still remain the same for the light and dark UI variations. So let's grab this background color for the highlight. Bring that into Colorable as the background. Let's grab our text color, and that'll be the foreground. So you can see we don't have enough contrast ratio for our needs here. I think our background color might be okay. We might be able to brighten up our text color a good bit here. All right, so after tweaking those values a bit, looks like we got it to pass the 4.5:1 contrast ratio. The background color we sampled is going to remain the same as what we found in our design. Everything's at that 234 hue. Let's bring in this new text color. So this will be our highlight text, and I think it'll remain the same throughout the different themes. We'll grab our background text value. All right, so looking at our color inventory, we're looking pretty good here. We just need to tackle the light theme colors that are remaining here. So let's actually grab this group. I'm going to cut it, and let's go over to our reference design for the light variation. And although this is a different screen in the app that we have to reference off of here, we can definitely glean some details in terms of the intended transition between the light and dark UI themes. So I'm just going to drop in this color inventory off to the side real quick. Now, the first thing we need to figure out is our main background color, which I think is just pure white. So we can get that added. I'll bring in that rectangle temporarily again. And let's call this main background. This will be the light version. Next up is the component background, which looks like it's actually white as well. throughout the light UI variation. There's no differentiation between the main app UI and the component background. So that makes things nice and easy. We'll just create a separate swatch for that. So next up, we have the high contrast text for our light theme. And it looks like, although it closely matches the main background of the dark theme, there might be a little more saturation if I look at the overall typography of the light UI. So we might want to make a dedicated swatch here. I think what we have is probably fine, so I'm going to color sample this and see if we want to tweak it a little bit. So let's zoom in and color sample some of this typography. And tweaking the values a little bit, I think I'm happy with this hex value. So we'll call it high contrast light. Now if we look for kind of this medium contrast text in our UI, we can see that we definitely have some that are very low contrast that we'll need to address in the placeholders for different sections. Let's see if we can also find kind of a secondary visual hierarchy somewhere in here. So maybe this step 4 might be an example of that. As well as this 30 minutes and some of this other date time information. So these are definitely going to be way too subtle. So let's sample them and bring them into Colorable just to check their contrast and get things adjusted as needed. So on a white background, we will have 11 for the saturation, it's pretty desaturated, and 77 for lightness. So you can see we're really low on the contrast ratio here. So let's get this adjusted a good bit. So with some adjustment, we now have above a 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio. And we also have more variation to bring in the darker text for the high contrast look while still being able to differentiate between the two levels. All right, next up we have the different elevations in our design. I think there's not as much differentiation in elevation for the light UI necessary because there's not really a box shadow. What I do see is we go from completely white background down into a pretty subtle off-white or the bottom right of some of these card elements. So I think our first stop of that gradient would just be pure white. So let's get this added for elevation 1 and 2 actually. As that background start. And now let's see what we want to do with this darker color here at the end of the card. Okay, so I'm going to adjust the hue to be 234 to be more in line with what we have throughout our designs. And after some tweaking, I think I like this subtle gray here. We drag our temporary swatch onto the design. I think that's enough visual differentiation to kind of see the barrier of one of these card components just on this bottom right corner. So I'm going to get this added. And I think this will hold true for the second elevation as well, but we can always refine this further. Let's make sure our naming is all settled on these. All right, I think the last thing for our color palette is the component guide that we saw around the avatar and dividing up some of the boundaries of components. And I think I like that subtle gray we actually used for the end of the gradient on our elevated components. So we're going to use that same hex value just to keep our palette nice and narrow. So EEEFF5. Let's also call this the component guide for the light theme. All right, so I've got our color inventory back in place here. you can see we have everything accounted for. I've also added the hex values just as a quick reference for our list that we have. And I think what I'll do soon is go into our particles page within our Figma project and make sure we add all the final color swatches with their associated contrast ratios that demonstrates the intended combination of background and foreground color. So here we just have some temporary placeholders as example components, but we'll want to go through and add all of our swatches with their intended combinations to demonstrate our full finalized color palette. So I think that'll do it for this episode. In the next episode, we'll start componentizing our design based off the component inventory we created, and also get our typography specs finalized to simplify all of the local styles that we have in this project. So thank you so much for watching, and be sure to keep a lookout for upcoming episodes.